it's going to be a very informal conversation and session as ever with our coffee mornings. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. You can even raise your virtual hand and ask it in person if you're so inclined to do it. But yeah, I am not a natural born interviewer, unlike my guest today. So please don't hesitate to chip in and to contribute to this session. So thank you for joining. I think following last week's coffee morning with Indian filmmaker Samarth Mahajan, I hope you all managed to watch it. We have decided to continue in our inspirational month of May, and we've decided to invite 29 filmmakers to this session, and the person who's brought them together in one beautifully and thought-provokingly curated book of interviews. So thank you very much, Pamela, for joining us this morning and for discussing your book, Lucid Dreaming. I'm just going to show it there. There's going to be a lot of product placement today. I'll make sure of this.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us. I just wanted to let everyone know that Pamela will also be reading excerpts from her book today. We're trying our best to pretend that this is real life and you're sat in a bookstore and the author is reading to you excerpts from her book. So Pamela, you are many things. You are a curator, you're a festival programmer, you are a producer, and you're a journalist and a writer. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the place documentary in all its shapes and forms, and experimental filmmaking is taken in your life, and what led you to interviewing all these amazing filmmakers. Even before you started thinking of a book, but just what brought you to this?
Sure. Well, my background is in producing multimedia and a lot of, branding and sort of the psychology of, the meaning of media, and what it does to the spectator, what you're attempting to do, et cetera, learning a lot about human behavior. In relation to media and how we consume it, its meanings, its various, forms. And in terms of stepping into the documentary world in particular, I just started volunteering in different film organizations when I lived in Los Angeles, just to dip a toe, and started meeting incredible people, with incredible stories, and seeing these films that made me think a lot about documenting reality, and all of the various, tangents, that come off of that. I was once, well, I'll say this, when I moved to New York in particular, and started my own blog, started my own documentary film blog, there were a lot of wonderful people writing about nonfiction at the time that became mentors for me. And I decided that instead of writing for others, what I really wanted to do, as these filmmakers were doing, was express myself in my own voice and my own point of view, and work on figuring out what I thought about all this out loud. The other thing was that in the documentary realm, the accessibility to people was extraordinary. I mean, I could get in touch with people, name whoever the person is from, Laura Poitras, and like all of these people that I felt, were doing extraordinary work. And I would email them and say, or Barbara Hammer for that matter, as I say in the book, I'm a blogger, I'm nobody, you don't know who I am, but I would love to sit and talk to you. And inevitably they said yes. And during the course of these conversations, they were extraordinarily generous, extraordinarily articulate. And I felt like I was like sitting at the knee of all of these mentors who could teach me certainly about making nonfiction, but who also really opened me up to a wider world, you know, each one sort of extrapolating upon the next. And it was a very rich experience for me. And it never really felt like an interview so much as a conversation. And I, I almost am not really even, I don't resonate with the word interview, you know. I've never been able to do a static Q&A very easily. So I would just prime the pump, as I call it, and talk a hell of a lot, just blah, 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 blah. And what would happen is, you know, that flow of conversation would start to open, and people would tell me, you know, things certainly about being a working artist or a working filmmaker in today's, you know, climate, but also so much more about what it means to be a working artist, you know, the responsibility of that, the joy of that, the difficulty of it, in all of its aspects. And so I just continued to be, it inspired almost everything else I was doing. And so I just thought, well, that's my preferred way of encountering someone's work, is allowing the artist to speak, the first person voice. I think is essential. And yeah, so that was kind of how it began. And then different publications, you know, I would pitch certain things, and it just broadened out into being able to do this for Filmmaker Magazine, Bomb Magazine, you know, the various other publications that I started to write for.
It's really interesting, because I want to say this book is absolutely not an academic work.
No,
It's not.
no, not at all.
It is very accessible, and also the you can feel that the access you have to all these filmmakers is very intimate, because they open up not only on their practice, and but they also share moments of doubt, of high fear.
Mhm.
They're very open, and it's almost like they're desperate to pass on those advice and those tips to other filmmakers in a very generous way. They're absolutely not in a posture of the artist in the know, or who's not understood and will never be. So why should they even try? The generosity both of your questions and their answer is really palpable in the book. So I wanted to make that clear. It's a very accessible, very inspiring, very practical book about filmmaking and about documentary filmmaking in all its in all its forms. So you felt that this book had to exist, and I'm just wondering, when did the title come, Lucid Dreaming?
Well, this book actually is 10 years in the making, or more, or longer now at this point. I remember I was at a festival, the Woodstock Film Festival, and I was with Ingrid Kopp, who maybe a lot of people know. And we were standing in the film section, sort of noticing how few of those books were authored by women. And the few books that even talked about, you know, female filmmakers. And at the time, my blog, Still in Motion, was not solely dedicated to female directors and filmmakers, but, you know, that I really wanted to create a space for the voice there. And so, you know, she's like, you should write that book. And I'm like, sure, right, okay, write a book. In terms of the title, I am Carl Jung is one of my heroes. And so I read a lot about, you know, the ways in which our conscious and subconscious are always communicating with one another. And I felt like that term lucid dreaming was such a beautiful description of what it feels like to be in the cinema, in a dark cinema with all these other people in the room, looking at a screen, looking at these moving images. There's something very atavistic about it. And you go into, hopefully, you know, you go into almost like a fugue state. That's why we're there. We want to be transported. And so I just felt, you know, it just came into my mind and I knew it was right. It's just one of those things where it just fit everything that I was attempting to do with this book, this sort of collective conversation and people communicating in various ways, you know, not just in verbal discourse, but in the idea of creating imagery that would transcend and reach into the deeper parts of us that many of us are not in touch with to begin with. And it's a very vital state for an artist to be in when you're creating, when you're fantasizing about the way in which you want to make a piece of work. So yeah, that's where the title came from. Yeah.
I think I want to ask you about the process or the processes of making the book and the curation, but also how do you turn interviews into a coherent book? And
Yeah.
but first, I think I'm just going to ask you to maybe read us a first excerpt.
Sure.
So I think we decided to start with Brett's story, who
Yes.
is US filmmaker. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about Brett, and then we'll hear your question and her answers.
Sure. Well, Brett Story is a Canadian filmmaker, but she has and scholar, you know, she's very much a scholar and a writer and a researcher. And she sort of has a diverse background, like most of the people I interview. Yes, you know, some went to film school and did a sort of very traditional trajectory in terms of, you know, the profession. But she has a very diverse background, and I mean, I'm going to read in her voice essentially, you know, so, you know, the way in which she describes why she tries to wrangle big free floating topics like racism, like climate change, like, you know, all of these things that we as human beings all over the globe are grappling with. And how to cinematize that, you know, that's her challenge. How do you sort of visually and orally convey thoughts and fears and, you know, all of these sort of abstract, more disparate elements of what it feels like to live in this day and time. Whenever I've seen her speak, she is one of the most poetic, articulate speakers that I've come across. And she's passionate, but she's also deeply thoughtful. And for me, this combination is, it's just really extraordinary, you know? And there's a lot about her own process that is mysterious to her. There's a lot about her own process and her own desires that she doesn't quite understand. And that's precisely why she makes films. So in this excerpt, I'm going to read, we kind of are talking about The Prison in 12 Landscapes, her first feature film, which took her forever to make because it's a non-traditional, you know, piece of cinema. And then we segue into The Hottest August, which at the time she was still pitching. And now, of course, has since been released. So that's Brett. So I'll read a couple of pages and then I'll just indicate where I skip ahead. Okay, here we go. So again, the book is in conversational format. So it's me, it's the speaker, etc. So I ask her in the midst of our conversation, even though issues of race pervade each of the film's 12 segments, you have this more tangible discussion with the woman who has a job and pays her mortgage and works very hard to have what she has. She talks about her initial refusal of the fine for not having the trash can lid affixed properly to her trash can. She's ultimately defeated and pays a hefty fine for this ridiculous charge because she doesn't want to go to prison. We learn that because she refused to pay at first, they just threw her in jail. This scene is aesthetically different from anything else in the film, and is directly emotional in a way that many of the other chapters are not. Brett's story. There was so much that was challenging in terms of structure. Despite the fragmented way in which the material is presented with this use of vignettes, I wanted the piece as a whole to earn its form as a film and not just a series of portraits. To figure out how it could build momentum was key. Avril Jacobson and I worked really hard to figure out how to do that in the edit. When we shot that scene where the woman shares her trash can story, I had an intuitive and immediate feeling that that was the heart of the film. Cinematically, it's definitely not the most interesting segment. It's a straightforward interview in her home. But there's something about the way she tells that story and what that story consists of. We could say that everything reverberates out from there. It isn't just about serving 30 years in prison for a crime one didn't do. It's about serving 15 days in prison for not securing a trash can lid correctly because you are a poor Black woman in St. Louis. I wanted to be able to earn a way of thinking about race by presenting the politics of racism and racialization in America while not separating it from these other issues touched upon elsewhere in the film. It needed to be emotionally affecting enough, certainly, but it also had to tie into all these other issues the film raises. Racism and classism in American society are played out in those people standing in line waiting to pay their fines, or in a person waiting for 3 hours to get on a bus for a 12-hour ride to a prison to visit a loved one, only to be told upon arrival that her shirt violates the dress code. It's a daily, slow violence that is deeply ingrained. Me. These thoughts make me want to segue a bit into the project you're working on now, The Hottest August. I saw you pitch it in Copenhagen in 2018 and was immediately captivated by the way you're approaching the topic of climate change. Again, you're attempting to cinematize this pretty intangible mood of free-floating collective anxiety and fear. What is it about making work for the cinema that holds itself together in such a fragile way? These glimpses into various aspects of our society that challenges and captivates you. Brett's story. One really basic reason I'm drawn to making films is that the process makes me feel less alone. It's definitely also an excuse to go on a journey and meet people and have conversations, but sometimes it's also about getting a feeling that's trapping me out and holding it away from me in order to examine it. The Hottest August is about just that. Like a lot of us, I've been overwhelmed with feelings that consist of fear, dread, incredible amounts of anxiety. I've extracted all these feelings and am working once again to examine them within the framework of making a film. What's political about those feelings? How and why is this the emotional zeitgeist of our age right now? So, in a way, the motivation is quite selfish, but it morphs into the motivation to make a project. In this film, there's the overarching premise of making a film about the prison system in which we never see a prison. That was enough to begin asking, okay, what will we see in here then? In The Hottest August, I wanted to make a film about the emotional life of climate change. Instead of imposing limitations, it's more about finding those parameters to work within an idea that might support that. In this case, the film was entirely shot over the course of 1 month in one city. That idea came directly from my love of Chris Marker's Le Jolie Mai, which was shot entirely in Paris in May of 1962. What I want to explore is how and why we are living with this notion that there is no future. What are the social consequences of that? Some work really well with story, but I don't necessarily get drawn into something through story, but through a more prismatic approach, where I just start collecting material and start to shoot. Moments, ordinary events, conversations with people. I was motivated to create a kind of archive of the present, one that would offer a kind of mirror in which to look at ourselves right now, but also that might be useful in the future for people who are going to want to know what we were all doing during this time when we all knew our planet was in such peril. What does that look like? That tends to be evident in those spaces of ordinariness, not really in the more spectacular moments. That's what I really love, for instance, about Chantal Akerman's films. It's in those ordinary moments where those feelings reside that everything, including the power structure we live within, can be discovered if you can figure out how to look at them. Sorry, my voice got a little scratchy there.
Thank you, Pamela. It's interesting because in an epic interview, you said that the aim of all these filmmakers, what they had in common was to stimulate the mind and the heart of the viewers. And I think that's exactly what your book does, by bringing these collection of voices together and giving those very, as I said before, those very practical but inspirational insight into their work. Because what Brett is sharing, she makes herself very vulnerable to you in her
Absolutely, yeah.
research of filmmaking, but at the same time she's giving invaluable advice to emerging filmmakers, but also more established filmmakers, and a reminder of always wondering, how do I translate a big theme, a big idea into images, because that's what cinema is about, images.
Right.
So that was a really really inspiring first excerpt. I said earlier that I wanted you to tell us a bit more how the process of editing the interviews, well, first of all, selecting the filmmakers, and then editing the interviews and finding the right pace, finding the right order. And how did that, it happened over the course of several years, but how did that come about? And what was driving you when you just made those choices?
That's a very complicated question, but uh, so extraordinarily, I got a publishing deal to publish a book on film, which is almost impossible these days. I mean, a non-scholarly work, I should say, sort of a more popular or populist book about the craft of moving image. Concentrating on nonfiction, but of course, you know, in the borderlands of what we do, fiction and nonfiction now are, you know, they can collide in really wonderful ways, particularly in memoiristic types of filmmaking, which, you know, more artist moving image work, you know, tends to deal with much more the interiority, you know, of feelings and notions and views upon the world. So originally, I thought this book was going to consist of something like 40 interviews, you know, like this grand, massive tome. And, you know, I had a big learning curve with this publisher, you know, because there are very, very practical aspects and financial and economical aspects to publishing a book. And my original manuscript for this was, I had to cut basically a third of the book, which was extremely painful. But I had a really wonderful colleague in Los Angeles help me do this. He's a professional book editor. But what I didn't want to compromise in any way, shape, or form is those artists' voices. You know, whatever had to happen in terms of this collection of voices, I wanted them all to be, I wanted the lion's share of whatever is between the covers of the book to be in first person from the filmmakers, you know? So in terms of choosing, I always have a running list of people that I'm dying to talk to. For a variety of reasons, but it's a very personal choice. It stems from seeing a piece of work or that has deeply inspired me, or encountering the filmmaker, you know, having met them in person, and feeling that there was a natural rapport there. And the other part of that, I think, in terms of how I wanted to present these voices, was that I've talked to so many filmmakers who, it's wonderful to have your films and your pieces of work reviewed, but there's always this, a lot of times, this, you know, divide philosophically and otherwise. And they often feel misunderstood. It's kind of like, well, yes, that's part of what I did, but there's this frustration, you know, that they aren't able to really express what it was they wanted to do. So I went for those makers I know who are eloquent, who are generous, who are able to talk lucidly about something that is extremely hard to talk about, which is an artistic process. And that was the driving force behind who I would choose. The the organization of the book and the curation of the book was at once purposeful, and I had a plan and a roadmap, but I have to admit that a lot of it was extremely serendipitous. Um, Things came across my radar unexpectedly, and all of a sudden, somebody I wasn't even considering, or maybe didn't even know, um, had agreed to talk to me for the book. So 29 is just a really strange number, but I'll explain that the way I structured it, and oddly, the structure of the book remained almost exactly the same through my whole process, which was kind of remarkable. But it was like a curation in the sense of I want these major topics. I want to talk. I want to hit this kind of way in which to talk about sound in film, to talk about borders, to talk about various ways in which someone might approach work. But it is an artificial construct, but it's mine. And so I could do whatever I wanted to. And it was actually great fun, to sort of figure out how that roadmap would look throughout the book. I also wanted the book to be read from cover to cover, but I also wanted the reader to be able to cherry pick and look at the table of contents and say, ooh, this one, and flip to it and read that interview. I mean, so it's a very malleable, flexible read, if you will, and a book to dip into, for inspiration at any given moment. But once I did have a core group of filmmakers, I decided that each section would be headed by an interview that I've already done. So it could have been like Barbara Hammer, for instance, was 10 years ago. And that was my first major interview with someone really big who has an extraordinary body of work. And so in essence, this book is also a little bit autobiographical. It sort of reflects my own journey in meeting these people and encountering these people and learning how to talk to them as artists, certainly in a general way, but the only way, and I will tell this to people who aspire to learn how to talk to artists, and I think it is a learned skill like any other, you have to do the work. I've talked to so many filmmakers who were convinced their interlocutor had maybe watched their trailer and maybe read a little bio and were coming to them literally not knowing what they were doing. I think the responses I get and the deeper ways in which people talk to me are because I literally watch everything they've ever made. Some people sent me stuff they made in college, so I can really immerse myself in their world. It tells you a lot about a person. And so I read, I watch, you know, really dive deep. And so then that's the only way the conversation then can be improvisational in a sense, I mean, obviously I have topics I want to cover. Obviously I have things I want to talk to them about specifically. But the goal, again, as I said in the beginning, is to make sure that they know that they're talking to someone who's fully there, who's really, you know, bothered to absorb the work. And I really think that that's the only way to get a really, truly generous, flow of thoughts and feelings. In terms of the interview in the written form, of course, it's edited and re-edited and edited again, just like any other piece of work. It's something that the makers and I collaborated on. I shared the transcripts with them. But it was really important that the genesis of that relationship start with a human to human verbal interaction, which is very awkward sometimes, very full of ums and ahs and silences and, but then you can edit it into a highly readable, piece of text that still showcases the heart of the matter. And so one thing led to another. It was kind of like a daisy chain of connections. Sometimes the filmmaker would talk about another maker And so I sort of investigate that. And it was this kind of free-flowing journey because the publisher didn't really lay down any kind of, remit about how the book should be and what should be spoken about, etc. So it was an organic process in a lot of ways. And it was a process I tremendously enjoyed. I wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I did, even though it was a tremendous amount of work. It was a very joyful process for me. And I was always in a state of deep appreciation for how generous these people were and how much they gave. But on the other hand, it was a chance for them to talk about their own work in the way in which they want to talk about it, and not leave it up to interpretation on someone else's behalf. I think I answered your question. I'm not sure. I hope I did.
Yes, yeah, absolutely you did. No, it's one thing you do absolutely amazingly is making us want to watch all these films, giving
Yeah.
us just enough context about the filmmaker that we don't feel embarrassed for not knowing them. Because I have to confess, when I ordered your book and opened the first few pages and I was looking at the names, and I felt really embarrassed because a few names stood out because they have worked with SDI before, but a lot of the names didn't ring a bell. And then I started, exactly as you mentioned, the format of the book allows you to do that. I just opened randomly and started at the start of a section.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I really, the next thing I wanted to do is to go online and try to find the work you were talking about. And that brings us to an interesting fact. So on the website of your publisher or our books, there is an extensive filmography, and I'm just going to share the link with everyone here. So
Thank you.
if you go to this page, you'll see that there is a filmography tab, and if you open this tab, you will have the list of all the films made by the filmmakers interviewed, but also contact details and production company details, so anyone can basically try and watch the films that are being discussed. And that's very generous of you, Pamela, to be giving us this amount of information. And I know for you it was an absolute priority to not disconnect these filmmakers' voices from their work and find a way, even though it's a book, finding a way of bringing their filmography at the foreground.
Right. Well, okay. So I will say about the unrecognizability, that was very intentional. When I first got this book deal, I'm like, all right, I'm going to reach out to Herzog. I'm going to reach out to Varda, who was alive at the time, who has since sadly passed away. I'm going to reach out to this person, that person, this person, this person, because of course they'll want to be in my book. So that was my first impulse. And then I thought, Herzog has not only, there have been reams written about Herzog, but he's also written his own books. And all of these people, there's a lot out there already on these sort of bigger, well-known filmmakers. I mean, my publisher, of course, was thinking in terms of book sales very practically, right? That you pick up a book but then I felt, but here's a chance to really shine a light on more, I'm not going to say they're obscure because they're really not. And a lot of them have made tremendous amounts of work, but they are unknown, they are, within a certain context and a certain milieu. It's kind of very circumscribed and very small. As is most of the art world, unless you're an Julian Schnabel or, some huge star. That was very important to me, to then turn to people who aren't ever really asked you know, about, or who don't get to do master classes, who don't get to publish books of their own necessarily. The filmography was a bit of a heartbreak because it was supposed to be between the covers of the book. That was the intention. And again, the makers in the book and I collaborated on this. It took a tremendous amount of time, but it was so huge that, again, economically, the publisher said, either you get rid of some of these interviews and we include the filmography, or the filmography has to go. And for me, that was like a no-brainer. And I said, can we publish it somewhere? Can we put it on, can we make it accessible at least to people who want to know? In terms of contact, again, because most of these makers are, you know, working artists, you can usually write to them directly. And they, again, because they're generous and because they want their work to be shown, will provide links or tell you, you know, okay, outside of COVID times, my films are playing here, you know, this is where you can see my work. Sometimes it's on the website. I know someone like Sky Hopinka literally opened up his complete Vimeo page. You can go and watch his films there for free. So they know, in a sense, this work needs to be as accessible as possible. But the filmography provides also, I think, a way in which you can look at someone's like complete, you know, body of work, let's say. And it's a dead document a little bit because of course they're continuing to make work. So yeah, that's the story of the ubiquitous filmography that is available, but unfortunately couldn't be part of the book.
So I'm conscious of time.
Yeah.
So I think I would quite like to ask you to read another excerpt.
Oh, sure.
And
Let me just.
I mean, maybe we could go directly to Mariam's Tafakuri's excerpt. And
Absolutely.
if we have.
Absolutely. So Mariam is a friend. She's a dear friend. She's someone I met several years ago. We were part of a symposium together. She is Iranian, but has lived in the UK and sort of goes back and forth. But all of her moving image work is done in Iran. And a lot of it is deeply personal. She uses her own body and voice in her work. And she has this modesty about her that is really beautiful to me, because she also too is a scholar and a writer and a deep thinker, and looks and uses her own voice and body as sort of a litmus to see stories that are that would be normally inaccessible to her as a female, as a young female in Iran. So there's also this huge amount of bravery on her part to literally go undercover, meaning physically, you know, and put the camera, you know, underneath her robes and shoot this really, really beautiful imagery, and then go back to her studio and make a story. So the part I'm going to read is about that process. Okay, I just have to tip this up so I can see. So I say to her, one of the images in I Have Sinned a Rapturous Sin captivates me, but I don't know what it means or what it signifies specifically. There are shots of a man threshing bleached cotton by hand in bright sunlight. Mariam says, that man is a cotton carter, and we used to take our pillows and mattresses to someone like him, and he removes the fibers and beats them as you see it in the film. It's an attempt to rejuvenate the fibers. Essentially, he's making a bed. The material part of everything I choose in my films is like this, representative. I didn't want a bed, but a material part of a bed. A bed also has a contradictory aspect. On the one hand, it's a site where a kind of holy event functions, that is, reproduction. On the other hand, it's a site where all these sins occur. The line between the two obviously is very fine in an Islamic or fundamentalist system. The cotton carder, for me, through his preparation and making of the bed, is manifesting this contradiction. But it's also about the fiber itself as metaphor for these kinds of systems and how they function. It's very subtle. It looks nice and it's peaceful and orderly, but it's also violent. I enjoy playing with that as some way to reveal things when I psychoanalyze myself, trying to go into the past and see why I like certain things. Why do I enjoy these things that I now recognize as violent? I like controlling my compositions, which you can see very clearly, but at the same time, it's kind of impossible because of the situations I'm in sometimes. So the editing is the last thing that happens, and it's based on what I'm left with after I film. It's unpredictable. I did have the cotton carder scene in mind while I was writing the text. I knew I wanted to film him very simply, so that was straightforward. But most things I'm filming, I can't control. I do enjoy that fact, even though it can be painful and difficult, and I have gotten into trouble. When filming Absent Wound, they threatened to take my camera away and call the police. I'm going to skip over a little bit to the very last, to another section here, where we're talking about Absent Wound. I say to her, this fear manifests in your refusal to concede to a lack of control. But we do understand through some of your body language that you're frustrated or even enraged. However, you never go wild. I think you know now that in Western culture, the way we deal with this embedded fear is the same, but it's manifested quite differently because the violence is overt, not hidden at all, in fact. The violence you're speaking of is something boiling underneath the surface and is controlled by a regime that is in place to make sure it doesn't boil over. The kind of fear that exists there completely speaks to the female experience. We must hide to protect ourselves. If we don't, we're vulnerable to attack. Mariam says, this thing that you say about me not going wild is really interesting. I always feel like there should be self-criticism in place, and I do think I should go wild sometimes. It's important to go wild, and it's important to get angry. For most of my upbringing, I was taught how to be sure not to go wild. I was taught to hide, how to stop, how to not say, how to never get angry, because anger is a masculine trait. It is something I try to resist, but I don't think I do it successfully. I can see in my work that I have a very conservative approach in a way. I'm very careful about what I say and how I say it. Basically, I'm scared. The main reasons for this have to do with the fact that I would still like to be able to go back to Iran. If I do get into trouble and am on my way back to here from there, how do I justify that my films are not political? I have friends who've been arrested for almost nothing in the last couple of years. It's not just going to places I'm not allowed to go. It's also about the time when I'm getting ready to leave. Recently, they've been having an issue with dual nationals, especially with Iranian, British, and Iranian Americans. So every time I'm returning, I have fear. It's funny how you can leave a regime and its totalitarian system, but yet you're still controlled by it, even miles away. I fear for my family. It's easy to underestimate the regime's control. I completely agree with you what you say about the West Islamic totalitarian systems. I completely agree with what you say about the West. Islamic totalitarian systems aside, more and more I'm becoming aware that similar things happen here. Women are raped and still blamed because they were wearing certain clothes, or they were drunk, or they were smoking, or they were wearing headphones. In the UK recently, the police warned women not to wear headphones or look down at their phones while walking alone at night. You hear something like that and suddenly realize that this is no bloody different. The Western system can have a lovely pat on the back when everyone describes how shit it is for women in these third world places. We treat you so well. Don't complain. There's a real form of violence also, to silence women by showing them how barbarically women are being treated in some other part of the world, and then telling them they're in a safe place. Yes, it's safe if you don't go out alone and don't wear this or that. There are all these suggestions about how not to get raped, but nothing about how not to rape. It's much worse here. In places like Iran, it's all right in your face. You put scarves on women's heads and it's there. You can see it. Here, the violence is a lot more embedded under the skin, so it's much more difficult to see. And that means it's a lot more powerful and a lot more brutal. She's a fierce little thing.
I almost want to hear her voice now. And I think that's an option, because I'm just going to open it to our audience for questions in a second. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about your podcast, because
Yeah.
you know, the book is one thing, but you crave hearing more, hearing about the voices. So I'm just going to share the link to your podcast, and maybe
Thank
you
you.
can tell a bit more us a bit more about it.
Mhm. Well, the book was published last year in a COVID year. So now I always had, it's always nerve-wracking when a filmmaker releases a new piece of work and, you know, there's nowhere to play it. There's nowhere to really debut it or have this kind of, you know, circuit, festival strategy, whatever. And I published my big project, you know, in the middle of the COVID year. Um, so um, I guess it was this was even before I think the book was officially out. Luke Moody, who is a curator, programmer, producer also, um, basically wrote to me and said, I'm so excited for your book. I've ordered the ebook. I'm like, you know, excited to read it. He said, have you ever thought of doing a podcast? Um, and I said, I have thought of doing a podcast, yes, but not necessarily a lucid dreaming podcast. And so this sort of piggybacked on to the publication of the book, so to sort of keep expanding the conversation and keep expanding the group of filmmakers. Um, Again, a big learning curve because I'd never done anything like that before. And of course, we were on our way to CPH and we were on our way here and we were on our way there. And then when we decided to start in March, we soon realized we were totally grounded and would have to figure out how to do this virtually. And so that's how we've been doing it since last year. We're working on our fourth anthology right now. Our anthologies consist of 7 filmmakers. Again, like a random number of filmmakers to talk to, loosely themed, curated in some sense, and to be able to use that same kind of format, you know, to take as we say, a deep dive into someone's work and to not have this kind of static Q&A. So to create an hour again in which, you know, someone can hold forth. And they are mildly edited, but basically what you're hearing is really the raw conversation. Unfortunately, sometimes the internet connection goes all wonky and, you know, things happen. So it's pretty raw DIY. Our statistics tell us we're big in China and Russia for some reason, which is really bizarre, but it's fun, you know, it's just the two of us, and we are just you know, able to keep reaching out to filmmakers that, you know, aren't included in the book, but who are able to be part of the lucid dreaming family. So in a way, it's more like a branding, if you will, for both the book and the podcast. And also, you know, to put it bluntly, you know, to help promote the book, of which I hope to sell, you know, as many copies as possible, like any author. So it's a real pleasure and a real privilege and a joy, you know, to do it in this way. I can edit myself in text, but so I was a little appalled at the first couple of recordings to hear my voice hemming and hawing and stumbling and blah, 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 blah. So it was a whole different, you know, it was a whole different thing. It's sort of an offshoot of the book, but it's its own universe as well. And Luke has proven to be a really fantastic partner. We make all of our editorial decisions together. And the division of labor is, you know, you know, you do this, I do this, and it's a very easygoing collaboration. So I'm super happy about that.
And the Lucid Dreaming Festival will be next.
Oh, okay, that I'll definitely need help with.
Thank you, Pamela. I think I'm just going to maybe take a few questions from people if anyone has got a comment or a question.
Absolutely.
Noe.
Hi, Noe.
Hi, Pam. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Congratulations. I mean, this morning's been lovely to listen to you. And
thank you.
It's amazing how creative you managed to kind of, to get with the book and around the book. And I'm kind of curious. I mean, obviously, the book came out of, the many years of curation of, at festivals and your love for cinema.
Right.
But I'm wondering kind of, now having kind of worked so hard and so long on the book, how is this kind of book going to influence your curation in the future?
Well, I think I will say that the act of curation, the act of doing this sort of careful selection, where pieces of work can speak to one another, is really, really important. There's so much content out there. We're drowning in it, And so I think the role of the curator now more than ever is really, really vital, all a curator is, in my opinion, is a guide. It's someone who gathers together, hopefully a larger journey that a reader or a spectator can go on. And so I'm really a fan of this kind of selection process, not in terms of and also in terms of mixing together different forms, different ways of expression, different voices, that can create its own kind of reverberation, that can create its own kind of questions, in a more open-ended way, and also to offset someone's work in a very particular context. So it's not this free-floating entity, it's part of this sort of family of or grouping of work that perhaps can expand, and even show off the individual works. Like I'll use the analogy of a jewelry setting, and it is this sort of constellation, that is its own thing. And I in talking to filmmakers about this and how they feel about being part of a curated program, I think for them too, it's a real pleasure, to see their work sort of sit side by side, and defer to someone else's imagination and someone else's taste. About what their film is saying, to me or to whoever. It's very, very personal. I freelanced for different festivals, but I'm not beholden to anyone. I have this freedom to sort of say, well, this person's only made one film, in fact. I mean, we don't know what kind of career they're going to have. But this film is really important. They did something here that's really extraordinary. To those, of course, who've made 20 films and will keep making 20 more and 20 more and 20 more. So there's also this way in which you can sit, brand new makers side by side with more established makers and see what that does to the work. So it's a very creative endeavor in and of itself. And so I believe in curation. I believe it's really important. And the structure of the book is sort of, my nod to that, because it's a completely arbitrary categorization. It was my own choice, and any of these makers could have fit into any of these categories. It wasn't about how to say, like, sequestering someone's work in a particular way. It was meant to offset it in a more expansive way.
I completely agree with you. I mean, and I do wonder I mean, if festivals should stop kind of, the concept or working with kind of programmers and just having curators, because all films in a way should be put in a context. I mean, admired for their, for the film itself, but
Right.
being able to create a context is really what, at the end of the day, is what the filmmaker also wants, to echo, expand on the meaning of kind of, of one film. And the programming of individual films and the whole idea of kind of awards, etc. I mean, I'm being a bit radical here, but being kind of post-COVID, where we are watching films in a very different way,
Yeah.
more than ever, I think, telling stories around the films, kind of, and that's really what curators kind of do, should be the way forward.
Right.
Something to talk about with the festivals.
We'll see. Their festivals are under a whole different set of pressures, of course, anyway, I just, I'm always fascinated, to sort of see how things are put together. And again, as I said in the beginning, to have these sort of guides, I mean, maybe you don't agree with someone's taste, maybe, but just to have, someone sort of serve you up kind of like a well thought out meal, or, something where the whole thing is an experience. And I personally really love that. And I admire, there's so many talented curators out there doing just that in various venues and in various ways. Even online, I did an online curation. So I even encourage makers, to do that as an exercise, curate your own little way in which you encounter certain pieces of work. It's an interesting exercise.
Pamela, we have a question from Julia.
Okay.
Hello, sorry, I'll turn my video on. Hi, Pamela, thank you so much. I'm incredibly excited to read your book, not just because I agree with Flor. I have to say, I went onto the Scottish documentary website and I was like, oh my God, I don't know any of these filmmakers, what's wrong with me? I think I know a couple. But I think just it sounds like there's a whole bunch of voices out there that I haven't heard from yet, but who would contribute to my own practice as a filmmaker. And I guess the thing I'm really curious about is, you said you made this across 10 years, and the role of documentary has actually, or sort of the popularity certainly of documentary has actually changed quite a lot over those 10 years. I mean, we're sort of talking about the documentary boom, which is maybe now 15 years or so in the making. But I just wondered how that influenced, or how you felt like it was maybe influencing the conversations you were having, or the reach you were having, or the amount of people who were working in the field. I mean, even if we don't know these names, they're still able to produce work. And I wondered whether you had a feeling like more were able to because of the shifts and how much of an audience there was for documentary.
Right. Well, I think maybe it's a misconception to think the book was 10 years in the making. The desire to make this book was 10 years in the making, but from the time I got the publishing deal to the time I worked on it was really like a year and a half. And so the collection here and the structure is, again, a little bit autobiographical. Like, who was I talking to 10 years ago? Who was I talking to 5 years ago? So those time markers are there. And I was hoping it would work only because what those people were talking about in a lot of ways, even several years ago, was a bit prescient as to how audiences would come to this kind of work. We've become more sophisticated as spectators, that this is a fact. And I think all of the, machinations of like, what is documentary and the D word and fiction and nonfiction and all of these, specifying, which genre something might fall into. Once I started moving into what is known generally as artists' moving image work, okay, kind of opened up this whole other conversation, or many other conversations, about this rigor or attention we need to pay to genre. Genre can be, again, we're going back to this notion of programming and this general way of looking at a piece of work, and dividing it into these very, very contrived and ultimately false categories of work. This is why I'm so drawn to memoir, because memoir can't be anything but a collision of fiction and nonfiction. It just can't be. This is how our minds work. This is how memory works. And so to cinematize things like memory, like trauma, like these kinds of very interior processes that we all go through, those were the makers I was drawn to. I would say the baseline commonality for all of them, no matter what genre they think they're working in or whatever genre is placed upon their work, really goes back to the individual impulse, to make a certain kind of work. And it's a real struggle. I mean, a lot of these are, you could say, completely unfundable projects. On paper, they can look wonderful, but what they're trying to do is something so subtle and so fragile. You feel like when you're watching it, it could just fall apart at any minute. And I find that really exciting. I find that when I see artists taking risks like that, I think that's absolutely key. And we can leave this genre conversation behind a little bit. It's a bit outmoded, in my opinion. Some people may disagree with me, but I don't want to come to, even when I read a book, I mean, okay, it says essay, fiction, nonfiction on the cover. It's just a suggestion, or a framework for what it might be. But that is the commonality here, that they sort of, they break genre very purposefully.
Did you feel, though, in that they were sensing that there was more of an audience for that as well, in the sense that the audience was willing to not have to stick to genre so much? Because I agree, I think as filmmakers, we cross work so much now. So many documentary filmmakers will want to work in fiction, and actually it's the act of doing that you want to bring into your work then. But I'm just quite curious about what the sense was from their side in terms of how people were watching it. Were they open to that, or was that sort of the next step? You were listening, but maybe the audience wasn't yet.
I think, well, in certain cases, when you say audience, it's more, a lot of these makers will concede, this is not a film for everyone. This is not a general, I'm not making films for a general audience, It's not that they don't think about the spectator, because I think a lot of them do, but in the process of making, everything like that, all of those considerations tend to be subsumed. And what I do notice in the documentary milieu that's a bit different from fiction or experimental, and that we have to be a bit cautious about, I think, is this constant rough cut scenario where you're showing a work in progress as you're making it. And it's just filled with so many pitfalls. I think there are filmmakers who are actually a little afraid of that. So especially if they're doing something, let's say, like social issue oriented, which of course you can put that label on anything, any piece of work. That's easy enough to do, but that's another way, I think, of constricting the work. It's another way of holding it hostage, to a label or to, a point of view. And I think what all of these makers in the book desire to do, they're authors. They kind of, if you think about writing moving image almost with a pencil, as Karim Ainous explains it, the author of the work and the author's voice and the author's point of view takes precedence over anything else. And of course, everybody has their trusted colleagues, but to sort of put a very fragile piece of work in medias res, like right in the middle of making it, and exposing it to sort of critique and opinion, I think this is also something that needs to change a little bit, because I've talked to many filmmakers that felt that instead of being constructive, they walked out of something like that more confused than ever, and excuse me, sort of lost their own thread. To me, this is very damaging, you know, to an artistic process. And this only happens in documentary. You know, you don't really have fiction filmmakers or experimental filmmakers necessarily obligated to do this kind of thing. And so it's to guard the work and to stay close to the work and to keep it sequestered and protected, I think is a really important gesture that makers need to have towards their own creations. Easier said than done, I know, because for every pitch and funding entity, and I know, you have to write and you have to, here's my film on paper, the whole thing done, boom. I get it, you know, so there's always going to be that divide. There's always going to be that, you know, that border there. And some makers are really, really, really good at pitching. Some are really good at writing. Some are really good at certain aspects of raising funding and attention for their projects. But that's like a whole different conversation. It's also something I really didn't wish to get into in the book necessarily in a very specific way. But I do always ask a maker, you know, do you think of your spectator? Who is your spectator? Who is your ideal spectator? And so I want to place myself in that position. I want to be that ideal spectator that they get to talk to. You know, that's part of my position when I come to them and say, you know, and I don't love everything everybody makes. I mean, you can't have a maker who makes and makes and makes and is prolific and have a genius piece of work every time out of the gate. In fact, I appreciate seeing that trajectory of really strong pieces and then seeing this fumbling, some sort of unsuccessful project, you know, but they put it out there anyway. And they keep going and they keep going and they keep going. That for me is really admirable because it's so lonely. And so, yeah, it's lonely. It's lonely, lonely work.
As I said, I think there's a lot to learn. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for sharing.
Thank you so much for your question. Thanks.
I think we're going to have to leave it that now. Persistence. That's quite a good word to end
It's
on.
everything. It's everything. There's so many things to stop you from doing what you're dreaming of doing. So many. But thank you, Flor.
Well, I'm just going to remind people that they can order your book in the paper version or in the audiobook, or paper and audiobook together. I really like that ebook. I really like this packaging on your publisher's website, which is orbooks.com. And thank you so much for joining us and for bringing those 29 filmmakers with you this morning. Thank you, Pamela.
Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good day.